It's Monday, the 1st September 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story says, Rivers LG pool. Atiku demands annulment as Wike reassets control. This can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story, Tinubu, police mourn as SIG Arase dies at 69. This can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Infractions. Federal government threatens to disconnect Gencos from power grid. This can be found on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story, Clap Foundation deputes to provide justice for the underprivileged. This can be found on page 14 of the Punch newspaper. Northwest leads in FEC projects with 5.97 trillion naira, says federal government. This can be found on page 29 of the Punch newspaper. Reps deny alleged planned showdown with Speaker. This can be found on page 8 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story, Union Bank of Nigeria completes merger with Titan Trust Bank. This can be found on page 31 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to Nigerian Tribune. The leading story says, no region playing second fiddle, none ignored, says federal government. This can be found on page 4 of the Tribune. And above that story from the right, Obafemi Awolowo Prize for Leadership 2025 call for nominations. This can be found on page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune. Why it is risky for PDP to field Jonathan Obi, says Kayamo. This can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. Union Bank completes merger with Titan Trust Bank. This can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. And below the leading story from the left, Tinubu, Agbetoku mourn passing of SIGP Arase. This can be found on page 30 of the Tribune. 4.8 billion naira railway earnings threatened. This can be found on page 30 of the Tribune. Health. Getting a bad night's sleep 3 consecutive days raises heart disease risk. Study warns. This can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. It is not right for Obi Amechi to promise to serve one term, says El-Rufai. This can be found on page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune. Moving over to Vanguard, the leading story says, petrol consumption down 28%, hype man groans. This can be found on page 23 of the Vanguard. And above that story, Getco increases banks paid up capital to 504 billion naira. This can be found on page 25 of the Vanguard. Tinubu has been fair to all sections of Nigeria, says federal government. This can be found on page 5 of the Vanguard. Union Bank completes merger with Titan Trust Bank. This can be found on page 24 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the right, wage increase. NECA, NLC urge states to emulate Imo, Ebonyi. This can be found on page 11 of the Vanguard. No sabotage in Abuja Kaduna train derailment, says federal government. This can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard. 2027. Keyamo wants PDP against fiddling Jonathan Obi. This can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. Rivers LG pools. APC sweeps 20 councils, PDP 3. This can be found on page 12 of the Vanguard. In sports, 2026 FIFA World Cup qualifier. Rwanda's Amavubi storm Nigeria tomorrow. This can be found on page 38 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the Guardian, the leading story says, medical tourism reversal narrative, a myth or reality. This can be found on page 8 and 9 of the Guardian. And above that story from the left, Lagos Life. 5 years after master plan expired, Lagos still in search of safe drinking water. This can be found on page 5 of the Guardian. Tinubu should overhaul NTA as Voice of Africa. This can be found at the back page of the Guardian. Spotlight. Nigeria at TCAD 9. Forging a stronger partnership with Japan. This can be found on page 10 of The Guardian and below the leading story from the left. Ogun releases land for Ijabode Inland Dry Port. This can be found on page 36 of The Guardian. Economic, financial crimes fuel insecurity in ECOWAS region, say stakeholders. This can be found on page 2 of The Guardian. If you are not running from justice, submit to EFCC investigation, group tells Haske. This can be found on page 37 of The Guardian. Education Minister makes U-turn, admits federal government ASUU signed agreement in 2009. This can be found on page 2 of The Guardian. Federal government explains non-publication of budget implementation report since Q2 2024. This can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. Moving over to the last paper on the list today, Business Day. The leading story says, Nigeria's power sector reforms fail where telecom triumphs. And beside that story from the right, Globus Bank completes 200 billion naira capital raise, awaits CBN's approval, says MD and CEO. This can be found on page 14 of the Business Day. Long road to Nigeria's education reforms. Broken education system threatens tomorrow's job. This can be found on page 30 of the Business Day. Akinwumi Adesina legacies. This can be found on page 22 and page 23 of the Business Day. Union Bank completes merger with Titan Trust Bank. This can be found on page 8 of the Business Day. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.